So in terms of the agenda for today, we'll review what we're trying to learn, give you a quick introduction on value, explain the concepts, and then go over what business development professionals, what role they play, and share a few concluding thoughts.
Yeah, so together, hello everybody, together we will review the principles and concept of value in the biotech industry. And we will see together how communicate and optimize the value and along the journey of a biotech company, and how also business development activities can contribute to the value creation. So we will start with some introductory topics now.
So there are many challenges that biotech firms and new startups are faced with. You know, how to stand out, whether to use a single product or a pipeline approach, whether to focus on a single therapeutic area or multiple, depending on what their compound might do, and so on and so forth. You can read on the left-hand side, you know, illustrative challenges that we've heard entrepreneur mention to us, you know, along the way.
So there's a wide spectrum of situations. So what do you think we always need to do?
So the approach itself is fairly standardized and simple in a way, as you can see on the right-hand side. It's really looking at the situation of the company, what they might have in terms of assets, what the weakness or strengths might be, and what valid path to development might be for the company. And really having a business plan that reflects and documents what you need to do so that everybody on the team is on the same page, and ensuring that you actually execute against the plan and verify along the way to make sure you're making progress. But, you know, Jean-Noël, these are fairly straightforward concepts, as I mentioned, right? So in your experience, why is it difficult to do for startups?
Yeah, what is difficult is that you have many challenges to deal with at the same time. You have the science, you have the technological aspects, but you also need to run the business. And so you need time, you need to focus on the various areas. And so it's very challenging, and resources are rare for biotech startups, in fact, as we know. So the question is, we need a compass. we need tools, in fact, to make sure that we are on the right path, and we are progressing towards still, I would say, an optimized value for the company. And so the question is what direction to take along the way. And so you will have high risk, long development programs, complex environments, of course, as we know, because you have a regulation, competition, you have the innovation to pursue, to demonstrate. And so you will have to build to make sure you have a robust intellectual property, and you are compliant with regulations. So it's a lot to do at the same time. So you need to be able to measure your progress along the way, and what we call value, and we will continue to define it. The value will help you as a compass, in fact, on this journey.
So essentially, you know, a lot of those characteristics of the biotech industry are, in fact, all of them are pretty much applicable to every biotech startup. So that notion of compass will be helpful. The notion of value to drive the common denominator for all startups will be helpful.
Absolutely. So now let's go deeper into the value concepts then, more precisely.
So, you know, the concept of value, if you look at the etymology of the term, we thought it was interesting to look at the Latin roots of that term. It means in Latin to be strong. Valere, the infinitive version of the verb, means to be strong, to have power, to be healthy. And value is an indicator which allows us to measure the capacity of a biotech firm to prevail, to perform strongly, to remain healthy as it matures and develops throughout its program and its research. And a simple gauge for that value, that concept of value, is the firm's equity, which are essentially its assets minus its liability.
So presented like that, it looks simple, but in reality, we know that it's more challenging. So
yeah, that's the point we'll come back to during the presentation, and how this might vary, for instance, with the maturity of a company as it grows throughout the development programs. So if you look at the concepts that are pictured on the right-hand side of the slide, it explains how a company will take its assets and capabilities and make decisions on operational control, for instance, what intellectual property to pursue, how to secure freedom to operate, what rounds of investment, which then will put some financial constraints on the company, or in terms of priorities, what to go after. As we indicated before, you might look for therapeutic area diversity, or you might look for time to market, but sometimes you may not do both of them concurrently because you want to save on cost, for instance, for the company. So the biotech leadership team will make those distinctions and those decisions, and also try to influence competition and make decisions on regulatory pathways.
It looks like some filters are more controllable than others.
That is exactly right, John. And in fact, if you look at these filters that we've portrayed in the framework, the competing priorities are things that companies and leadership make on a regular basis. Operation controls are also decisions that are more punctual. In comparison, they may try to influence the competition or the regulatory environment. They may do so by, for instance, selecting a mechanism of action that might be innovative compared to standard of care or competitive pipelines, or they may elect to a pathway where they go after pediatric studies to have more time, more exclusivity on the market once they get marketed. So the first two filters in blue and brown are more readily activable than actionable than the green and the yellow one.
And of course, I think they don't happen sequentially, but at the same time, in fact. Yeah. So in fact, what we call value, in fact, it's so we will see together that it's a gauge, okay, it's a valuation of the company, and it implies that you will, on a dynamic way, be able to go through the roadmap. So you have to be clear about your roadmap, how you will develop your assets, your programs, what are the key inflection points along the way. So a lot of decisions to make regarding should I acquire new capabilities, new assets? Should I divest some? What are the core assets I have? And so the concept of maybe portfolio of programs. You have to deal with the infrastructure as the company is growing, the team, of course, and you have to create, in fact, all the business side apart from on top of scientific and technological aspects. So you will have to adjust your business plan along the way, and to simulations to take better decisions.
So as we get further in depth into the topic, Jean-Noël, in this example, it seems that phase 2 or proof of concept is associated with the highest increase in value for a biotech company. Why is that?
Yes, in fact, if we consider the development plan of a typical drug development, this is where end of phase 2, when you have an end of phase 2 meeting with a regulatory agency, for example, you will have the clear view if you have reached the proof of concept for your mechanism of action, if you have a clear dose ranging for it, so all the pharmacology, so you have in fact some effectiveness, in fact, of the drug, and so you will have in fact what we call we have reached a nice de-risking, in fact, the full development plan. So after you have still some challenge to accomplish or to overcome, but this one is a really important one.
Yeah, thank you. And then, you know, the other question one might ask is, you know, on this slide, for instance, how does a team influence the value or the valuation of a firm? There are really two aspects to consider. First is the perception of the company, and the second is the execution capability of the company. In terms of perception, for instance, having a well-known chief scientific officer on the board of the company or as an advisor as well, really points to having the relevant expertise in a way that will impact the development and lower the development risk, while at the same time signaling to the market that the company has a, you know, value from a distinguishing itself from standard of care or other drugs in the competitive pipelines. So, you know, there are very important concepts to take into account when dealing with value in a biotech environment, and they revolve around IP and innovation. So, as you see on the right-hand side here, there are, you know, obviously patents that are filed by the research companies. There's a market exclusivity granted upon approval, and so on and so forth. And if you're looking for the actual facts for a given medication that's marketed, you can find that in the FDA Orange Book. But the basic concept that a biotech firm will work with is a freedom to operate. In other words, can they make or sell all their products without hindrance without infringing on somebody else's intellectual property? And then the other concept is that of ensuring that they have operational control for their own IP, that they're innovative, that they protect themselves from the competition in order to secure that commercial profit that they get once the drug is marketed.
Can you elaborate a little bit more how it relates to the value of a company?
Sure. So, for instance, the exclusivity and patents have an extremely strong impact on the revenue curve. When you do a discounted cash flow analysis, for instance, you will be looking at the revenue streams that are far in the future, typically when you're starting to develop a drug. And this IP will ensure that you will see those revenues come once the drug is marketed, if it gets approved, and that another company will not produce, let's say, a generic or something that would compromise your ability to extract those returns as a company on the back end side.
Okay, thank you. So in fact, we can say that the road to success, the financial road to success, is full of terms. We can say on the picture, and in fact, the entrepreneur will have to overcome a lot of challenges, as we said already, and so we'll have to, in fact, to have some clarity, in fact, about the roadmap, about the resources, the good resources at the right time, and the ability to take good decisions based on expertise. So, in fact, it will have also to make sure that the company is focusing on therapeutic areas which are, in fact, where you have an important need, in fact. And so it will increase also the probability of success, economic, I would say, probability of success of the company if it's targeting a market with some size and desirability. Yeah, so you have also in the ecosystem various supports that can help the company, of course. So you sponsors, and you can have subsidies or grants. So it's very important also for the biotech company. So
Jean, you know, we mentioned here social capital or prior investments, why would these, arguably that might be in the past, influence the value of a company of a biotech firm?
Yes, one important component is, in fact, the value is not always assessed with quantifiable measures, but it's also the fact that you are supported by partners or by sponsors. For example, if you have been able to partner with a big pharmaceutical company, it will bring, of course, to the biotech company a strong recognition and a validation of accomplishments so far.
Thank you. And so now we get to a stage where we look more at the hard mechanics of how you approach valuation for life science projects. And as we discussed before, the approach that will be used will tend to depend on the stage of development of the company. So you have early stage companies that are pre-IND and that will use typically more straightforward valuations like multiple precedent transactions, comparable companies, or some sort of scorecard assessment from an interesting valuation perspective of the company. Once you get to the IND, so mid-stage companies till phase 2 proof of concept, or more advanced companies after that phase 2, you can then use more readily the favorite workhorse, as I would call it, of the industry, which is discounted cash flows valuation, where you try to put along time the different investments and the revenues and operational expense that the company will incur to bring a drug to market and then keep it on the market itself once the post-approval by the FDA or regulatory authorities. You still have the option to have relative valuations, precedent transaction analysis, and comparable at that stage.
And here on the chart, the slide, it seems that we have the same methodologies for mid-stage advanced. Can you elaborate a little bit on the similarities or differences?
Thank you, John. The idea is that as you learn more and get closer to the market and get more clinical trial results and more accurate information, the models that you have become more and more sophisticated. So the DCF will be more reliable, for instance, and a prominent consideration, whereas in the mid stage, it's relatively more important to have that triangulation, even though that triangulation is still important for an advanced company. So Jean-Noël, I mean, turning things back to you, I mean, you do this on a day-to-day basis at Sanofi for either programs, portfolio, or companies. What would be a key consideration you would suggest for the audience in terms of distinguishing what you might do for a program versus what you might do for a company, for instance?
Yes, we can say, in fact, the approach is the DCF approach, for example, is very powerful in the sense that if you can do an intrinsic valuation for an asset, it means that you can value the entire company because it's a basket of assets, in fact, in this sense. But you need also to compare to the market. So what was other industry players ready to pay for similar assets or companies? So the question of scope is important when you compare. So you have to. It's very important when you do evaluation to have the addition of several approaches, some which are based on your convictions, your homework, your assumptions, and some which are coming from the market data, publicly available data, either from the deal terms paid by others or deal transactions paid by others for similar assets, or you can have what we call here comparable companies, meaning on the stock market, you have companies that have a price, a stock price, and you can find interesting similarities. So we will come back to that just now.
Thank you, Julian. So now let's first focus on, as you can see from the funny picture on the screen, on relative valuation, where you compare what you see or a given company or program to others like it.
Yes, for example, here we can show the precedent transactions and approach. In fact, when here we took an example of public deals, in fact, that you can find on the internet. In fact, you have some partners, so a licensor and a licensee agreeing about the license can be exclusive, non-exclusive, with a collaboration or not. And you can find, if you do some research, you can find some comparable deals for comparable indications. You have to make sure you are apple to apple in the sense that are reasonably close to each other or comparable. I have in mind, for example, the technology or the stage, the drug stages. You cannot compare an advanced program with an early program, of course. So you have to narrow down a little bit the sample to make sure you have a consistent basket, a group of items. And so then you can build your statistics, like the upper green table, when you say, in fact, I feel that the market valued this type of asset. When somebody wants to acquire the rights to a typical asset, they will be generally on average pay maybe 90 million. So after you can discuss if the sample is correct or not. Yes.
So Jean-Noël, looking at that green table on the top, it looks like if we want to do, in this case, licensing for oncology, antibody conjugated and preclinical stage, we're looking at somewhere around 18 to 19 million upfront payments, somewhere in the 400 million range for milestones, and some level of royalties. So how do I decide as a biotech startup how far above or below those amounts to go, and what level of royalties to add, if any? And said differently, how do I leverage the blue table we see on the screen to make actual decisions about my own program?
In fact, this approach will be used most probably generally to comfort evaluation you are doing in parallel. To comfort, and we will see that ultimately you will have a range of value. In fact, you have not, valuation is not one figure, one amount. So here it's to comfort that you are probably in the right range with another approach, and so you combine both. And so it's a very case by case. And we have to know also that these transactions are transactions done on the market. So it means that the supply and demand aspects are influencing these figures, of course.
Thank you. And so here we look at a comparable analysis example, which was one of the other approaches that we discussed before. And you see a number of companies, the technology, again, cell therapy, oncology for therapeutic area, clinical stage in this case, number of employees. And I would direct your attention to the column that says market cap 200 days. That is the daily average over 200 days for the market capitalization of those companies. And if you subtract the net cash position, that the cash that they have on their books, that gives you an enterprise value that except for cash, that is in the last column. And so you see a range of quite a wide range, from 65 million to 242 million, with an average of 140 million. Now, if you want to try to narrow that range to get something comparable to the company you're thinking about acquiring, you will notice that the Adaptimmune at the bottom has got one drug that's at the BLA stage is about to be filed. So, and you also notice that the enterprise value is much higher for that one. So you may adjust and decide, okay, I will exclude this from my sample because it's not readily comparable, and therefore my average is 106 million.
And would you use this methodology for an asset or for a company, in fact?
Thank you for asking that question, and that's a very good point to add. And in fact, if you look at the box in orange towards the top of the screen, it really depends on what the information you have available. Typically, funding rounds are for company valuations, analysis and research reports, or databases that you may have access to could be for either assets or company valuation. The key is really to compare apples to apples. So you take assets to compare them to an assets, or you take a company to compare it to a company. And last but not least, stock market value is obviously for companies.
Okay. So we have seen the relative valuations now.
Yeah, go ahead.
So let's continue and see the third approach, which is more what we call the discounted cash flows. It's a synonymous as net present value. So it's the more an intrinsic valuation. So meaning when you want to focus, for example, on a project, like if you will run it to the market and beyond, you will use this methodology, and you will use very, let's say, a lot of assumptions that are related to the product itself. So generally, we want to value the project over its full life. And so then we have, and it's very powerful in terms of story, by the way. You can build scenarios. So generally, you will use assumptions that are about the pre-launch aspects, that are the development assumptions, and commercial assumptions. So all these assumptions gathered and put year by year on tables will help you build the forward cash flows, expected cash flows, that are your projection. And as it's discounted, it's what we call DCF. We have an aggregate. The sum of these projections is an aggregate value we call NPV. We can be probabilized because we have a probability to get to each phase and up to market. Or it can be a scenario when it's given success, you do the projection if everything works well. So you can do both, of course.
So Jean, let me ask you maybe a two-part question on this. Is at some level we have a number of figures here that are both for project development and for project commercial assumptions. Are those really realistic figures, or they're just for the case example?
So this one completely illustrative, but they are not so unreasonable. So, of course, the assumptions will be absolutely case by case and to be refined case by case, of course. So here it's just for the illustration, but they're relatively realistic. Realistic enough to be presented here and to give a sense that you should be, for example, you see a success rate in phase 2, which is only 33%. So it means that you have to combine phase 2A, phase 2B in this case. And so you have a probability of success, which is below 50% at this sequence. So this is realistic in my view. And so maybe you can ask also why we take only the forward cash flows.
And that's a good point to get the attention of people. I mean, you're not trying to evaluate the program from start to finish when you started a few years ago till when you go to market. You're trying to evaluate the program at this point in time, in other words, forward cash flows, to decide whether it still makes sense, yes or no. And you're not looking at sunk costs, in other words, costs that you already spent in the past. So here's a graphical illustration of what we're talking about. You're looking at phase 1 ready graph at the top. In other words, as the program is about to enter phase one, and at the bottom you're looking at phase two ready, meaning when the program is about to enter phase two. And you see that the square in purple is translated from one to the other because you haven't changed your assumptions on revenues and costs that you will incur moving forward. The things that you should look at is on the left-hand side, you see remaining R&D cumulative at beginning of phase one at 378 million. Beginning of phase two, it's 350. We already spent 28 million in phase one. Time to market, you're getting closer, 8 years, sorry, versus 6.5 years at the bottom. And when you're about to enter phase two, you have a probability of success to market, which is now much higher, almost double, essentially doubled from 9% to 18%. The discounted cash flow value is 564 versus 702. The risk-adjusted discounted cash flow, however, is very different, from 5 million only at phase one versus 83 at phase two.
And can you explain why you have this jump in value?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. So essentially, as you look at the graph, you see that the orange bars are up front. That's why you invest in clinical trials and development. And those costs are closer in time and therefore much more probable than the later cost on that depend on market success. So you have also a bit less costs when you are at phase two ready than in phase one. You have those 28 million less in spending, and so essentially different in likelihood of the profits versus the investment is what generates a big difference between the two.
Okay, so here we try to summarize also what we have seen before the curves. So if you are at different stages, you can simulate, in fact, the value going forward. Okay, so for example, we see in before phase two, you would be valued at 83 million. But after phase two, you will be valued at 439 in this example. Okay, it's perfectly illustrative because, in fact, as we said, you have been able to get a positive end of phase two meeting. You demonstrated your mechanism of action, your proof of concept, and you know far better the product, your reliability and dosing. So in fact, you are very your dossier, in fact, that your dossier is much more advanced than before, and you are ready to test it on a much wider scale for phase three. So, and the phase three will bring also its own de-risking, of course, a huge de-risking, if you are able to demonstrate that it's still efficient, effective on a wide scale.
So, Jean-Noël, let me kind of turn around the same question you asked me on the previous slide, which is that, if you look on the green arrow at this 439 million risk-adjusted NPV post phase two, if I take 59% of that, of the 1.4 billion on the right-hand side, that 59% of the 1441 doesn't come to 439. Why is that?
Yes, because in fact, you remember at the beginning, you have all your investment in R&D to perform year by year, phase by phase. So, and the probability to spend is higher than the probability to get to the market. So the NPV, risk-adjusted NPV, take that into account because the expense will be more probable and will be also closer. And the market, the commercial value, in fact, will be its further in time, and of course we'll have only the cumulative probability to occur. So this takes that into account.
Yeah, thank you. So now if you look at the various type of events that influence value for a biotech firm. Whether it's you're trying to value a company or a program with DCF or some of the alternative valuation models we saw, there are very different events that can influence them. So it could be human capital, could be social capital, could be grants, could be development approach, commercial environments, or clinical trial results. Any of those, as you see on the illustrations on the screens, can affect the value of the company.
And for example, can you elaborate on pricing?
Sure. So if you take the line that says commercial environment change, for instance, if you have a product that in the example mentioned, where a competitive products gains approval earlier, which will essentially change the order entry on the market for your drug and potentially its pricing, this will have a huge impact on the revenue curve for your discounted cash flow. So typically the shape of the revenue curve is a function of the entry on the market, the order entry, and the magnitude of it is a function of the pricing. So in this case, you would be affecting both the amplitude of your curve or revenue curve and the shape of it. So that would have a really huge impact on your discounted cash flow and the valuation of the company.
So in fact, as we said, the entrepreneur will have to discern the known and unknown. So it's much more difficult to discern what you don't know, but you have to know that you don't know. And in fact, you have a lot of so many uncertainties and factors that can impact the value, so that you have to keep an opening and listening to all the factors that can influence the roadmap and the value. So regarding your expected market, what can change, the product profile, which is targeted and expected reasonably foreseeable. You have to be very, let's say, aware about the real patient needs, in fact, and to make sure you get market acceptance, or you know what it means to get a market acceptance before, and to be able to manage your constraints regarding the supply chain. Sometimes you have difficulties to scale up, so it's very crucial to not underestimate this aspect. And of course, you have to anticipate the future commercial launch, in fact, the preparation. So if you look at a graph we just mentioned a bit earlier in the presentation, is a evaluation football field where you look at the different ranges for each of the methodologies you've been using. So it could be the discounted cash flows at the bottom, comparable in second precedent transactions and so on, or your own customized internal benchmarks in terms of what you've been selling. You will pick something value that tries to make sense out of the four ranges. And here you see illustrated on the graph the preliminary target valuation of 439 million for a program we'll come back to later in the slide, in the presentation. And so here you would focus maybe on precedent transactions for this one? So that's a good point, John. And precedent transaction seems to have a lot of upside here on the slide. The other part you have to take into account is the market situation and the current environment. So those precedent transactions, in fact, where the case example is supposed to be current, and therefore the precedent transaction where in an environment that was much more favorable to such transaction in the past. So you have to look at the context and the specific comparisons that you're doing. It might be that your own program might be comparable to the lower end of the range and the higher end of the range, as we saw in the illustration before with a marketed or drug getting to an BLA stage. So really comparing apples to apples is important, and understanding the underlying assumptions behind those ranges. Thank you. So now we get to the role of business development, professional business development and M&A. That is the folks working on M&A and licensing deals. We will explore in the coming slides
4 categories of contribution they make: understanding of the market, model expertise, process excellence, and last but not least, relationship building with the targeted partners or targets, and negotiation with other parties.
And for example, all the business development and M&A professionals will, of course, monitor and try to see leading indicators like the size of VC rounds and or the Nasdaq Composite, the stock market, the number of IPOs, size of IPO, in fact, to try to identify the current trends. Because if you want to partner with a biotech company or with a pharma company, you will have to be aware of what is going on in the financial industry and what your partner maybe is facing some constraints, financial constraints for that. Yeah,
so you know, Jean-Noël, as I look at this, you know, I understand the importance of using you know, building your own industry tracks and trends that you track. The question I would have for you, can you very briefly explain why the current environment, for instance, would make out licensing more desirable right now, maybe in a couple of sentences?
Yeah, we see that here the situation has been very specific, in fact, very strange, because you see on the right side that the VC rounds have been very strong, in fact, in the recent past. But nevertheless, on the right side, the value, stock market value, and a number of IPOs and size have been reduced dramatically. So, in fact, the question is, how will the startups or biotech companies will find the way to expand their financial capabilities, the funding, in fact, in the future. So maybe they will try to find partners and to out-license part of their portfolio. It's a question.
Yeah. Thank you. So, you know, the second piece that the business development professionals bring to the table are the modelization expertise. So understanding what make deals comparables, whether it's the market, the maturity of the company, development stage of the drug, the therapeutic area, or you know, or another therapeutic area that's similar risk, the technology itself, the mechanism of action, the biotech firm, and so on and so forth. Really having in-depth expertise and experience in building comparables is very helpful. Having access to the right information from investment bankers or database providers, whether it's Torreya in this case, or Biopharma, as 2 examples mentioned, and then being clear and explicit about what makes a company honest, comparable. This avoids a lot of headaches on the downstream in terms of making sure everybody's on the same page and has the same understanding, so that the discussion or the facts that are underlying the discussion are as indisputable as possible.
Yes, and in fact, the toolkit, I would say, of the business development professionals is to be aware of the market, to be able to compare, to do comparisons, but also to find the right transactions to be performed for the right assets or the right scope. So they will have sometimes to activate more the in-licensing or out-licensing, depends for some assets, because it's more relevant, it's the right timing, and to partner or to acquire or divest. So the toolkit is very rich, flexible, and so you have to find the right, what is relevant, in fact, to create value.
Yeah, no, so that process, which is a key part of it. And I do remember when we were discussing this presentation, you mentioned the equity play that comes more of a front and center role these days. Can you maybe say a word about that?
Yes, sometimes it can happen that, in fact, you can start discussions around a licensing deal, and maybe at some point a more strategic relation or alliance could make sense with the pharma company having an investor role. So the objectives depend on the context of the discussion. So maybe it's an equity first and a right of first refusal or first negotiation at a later point, or an equity plus straight license now. So it depends on case by case what is relevant for both parties. But it's true that we can see that happening often.
Yeah, thank you. So I think now that we can have another example, maybe Jean-Noël, that you can walk us through in terms of the workhorse of for applied to licensing, the DCF applied to licensing.
Yeah. So very quickly, because I see that it's I know it's a very rich slide. So in fact, you can take the example of two parties, a licensor who owns the IP and a licensee who wants to pay, who is ready to pay, to negotiate deal terms to acquire the right to develop and to commercialize the IP. So the question is how to find the right range of negotiation between parties and narrow it through negotiation at the end, do a contract, an agreement. So generally we have worked on our DCF and PV, so we have an idea of the intrinsic product value. You can also complete that with relative valuations, as we explained before. And so you have what we can call a product value, which is with no deal terms, like it with full value life, full product life. So the question after, if you apply such structure of deal terms, you will be able to see how the value, the product value, is shared between partners.
And John, just to be clear, deal terms, you mean essentially upfront payments, milestones, and royalties, correct?
Yes, you can have it's a mix, in fact, of its deal structure, can be front-loaded or back-loaded. So here we have several examples on the slide. When case one would be a little more front-loaded, you have 70% of the deal terms that in terms of financials that are pre-launch, and 30% post-launch. And you see how it evolves if you do simulations or negotiations to get a more backloaded deal structure. So everything will depend on the product profile, the risk which is associated with developing this product, the risk with the commercial assumptions around uncertainties regarding commercial assumptions, and the negotiation of both parties.
Okay, and so Jean, I was going to ask a question about case one on the slide, but for the sake, for time reasons, probably keep the question and just make a comment that essentially it's important for you to put yourself in the other party's shoes and see and try to guess how they would model. Here, for simplicity, we've assumed the same value for both, but that may not always be the case. So it's really understanding what will drive the value for the other party, which brings us to the next slide. Actually, is a very good segue. If you look at what the licensors might do, you see the licensor's perspective on the top, where with a orange bar in terms of what they see as potential values for the programs, and you see the licensee's perspective at the bottom, and typically what they see as on an orange bar in terms of values, and typically lower than the licensors. And where there is overlap, there's potential negotiation. So the licensee and licensor, the BD professional, business development professional, will build relationships with other parties that they may be interested in making deals with, to build trust over time and have the ability to influence the other's perspective. The licensor is trying to lower the expected, the licensee is trying to lower the expected values from the licensors, and correspondingly, the licensor is trying to influence the licensee so that they see higher value in the program. In the example on the screen, you see that there is some understanding in terms of deal terms and a final deal agreement somewhere between the two ends of the possible negotiation zone at essentially 400, I think it's 39 million that we used as same as before, if I remember correctly. So let's go over some concluding thoughts. Maybe Jean-Noël, you can get us started.
So to recap, in fact, you will have the internal management, but you have also the business development and M&A tools. Both work well if they are completely integrated. You know, we did this kind of cycle when the capabilities in terms of internal capabilities and business development approach are completely well integrated into a value mindset, and so it will be, in fact, if you reach this level of integration and quality between internal decisions and the BD, let's say, efficacy, you will have, frankly, a very, let's say, highly successful chance to optimize your value.
Yeah, and you know, if you guys like what you saw today, you know, please tell somebody and tell us as well what further topics you might be interested in learning about. We've put some food for thought in the green square on the right hand side, and we also wanted to let you know that we will have an event along the same lines in November, tentatively for November 9, which is the Life Science Panorama. It's a keynote event for the French Chamber of Commerce. It's a usually great event that you should really try to attend. Great speakers, great panels usually. So would highly encourage you to attend. And if some of these topics on the screen are of interest to you, or if you have a need for further questions, whether it's you know, limited pro bono guidance for a small startup company or consulting support and whatnot, please feel free to contact us. We'd love to hear from you, both in terms of feedback for future topics and in terms of your impressions. So with that, we'll open to questions if we still have time. And thank you very much.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jean-Noël and Alain. We have a question in the chat. DCF is generally used for established businesses. It's one of the techniques used in the context of liquidity events, but never for early stage companies. What would you advise for early startup stages?
So great question. Thank you for coming back to this. I'm trying to come back to the slide here. So for early stage, we suggest essentially comparable transactions, comparable companies, or you know, some VC companies will use what's called a scorecard valuation. They will look at the criteria like the ones we have on the interesting valuation square on the left here. That's towards the top. But it's really harder to come to terms with evaluation for, and there's a lot more art than science at that stage. I would agree with that.
Yes, absolutely. So here's you will have more importance given to the multiple approaches or relative valuation that we call it here. So you will try to find comparable companies, comparable situations when you can say for this type of asset, the market is such value at early stage. At some point you are at the limit, you can maybe, you have maybe identified already the indication that you are targeting. And so maybe at this point you can try to do some preliminary DCF, but of course it's so far from the market that your probability to get to the market is maybe less than 10% or 5%. So for sure, it's very rare to have a positive risk-adjusted value at this stage, but you have to find where it becomes positive.
Yeah, and that's also where the science and the differentiation becomes more critical, and the articulation of that message by the management team. So again, that scorecard valuation plays a key role in those early stages. Ludivine, any other questions?
No, this was the last, the only question in the chat.
Okay.
Okay, so if there are no further questions, we'll probably wrap up. Ludivine, I think you may want to share maybe some announcement about future events from the Chamber as well.
Yes. Yes, so I just wanted to mention that we have 6 events lined up until the end of June. Our full program is available on the homepage of the Chamber's website at faccne.org. This event today was co-organized by the Facc'Fin, the Finance Forum of FACNI, and the FABS, Life Science Forum. The Facc'Fin is organizing a meetup, an after work on June 1st. Registration is open, and for those of you who would like to network in person, we are bringing back the European American networking event on June 16th. It's going to be hosted by Natixis in Boston, and the capacity is limited to 150 guests. So we encourage everybody to register as soon as possible.